Welcome everyone, and good afternoon and or good evening. So we'll wait for a few minutes until everybody populate the gathering, and also I'm waiting for Professor Ramon Grosfoguel to join us. So just give us a second. He's trying to link to the webinar. This is a conversation really that's been sometime in the making. If it was not for COVID-19 and the circumstances, we would have been in teaching in Grenada and having these conversations and discussions that covers the spectrum. So our hope today is really to delve into some of the key concepts that Professor Ramon Grosfoguel have developed in his, both in his writing, in his scholarship, as well as public engagement. Professor Ramon has contributed considerably in terms of literature, scholarly literature, as well as literature that comes, you could say, from the ground up. In terms of his contribution. And as such, we will hopefully delve into some of those areas that are of interest to both scholars and activists in the US, in Latin America, in the global South in general. And Ramon is definitely well connected to both scholarship and activist at both ends of the spectrum in here. So we'll wait and see. And I see some of friends. Abraham, welcome for joining us. Look forward to your question. Farouk, it's good to see you. Isra, good to see you. Congratulations on the marriage. Kathleen, also welcome. Hanum Sheikh. So I see a lot of friend Marwa Ibrahim, welcome for joining us. Reem and Robert, Reem Khusba and Robert Bishara, welcome, and congratulations on your book as well. And look forward to promote it and have you also in a conversation in the near future. I'm trying to get Professor Ramon to join, and to see, I'll text him right now, technology in action. Check your email. So really the topic that we wanted to address, power, the concept of decolonization and what does it mean, in relations to the contemporary period, but also as a field of scholarship. Ramon is one of those who continue to write and engage in the subject. Also, Ramon is one of the scholars that have really centered the 1492 and looking at world history from 1492. It's an area that I think it's a major contribution, both as an individual that deals with, myself deals with, Ramon, you need to turn the camera. That's it. Okay, now, okay. Good to have you, Ramon. It's welcome. I was just having conversation and getting everybody situated for us to begin. So Ramon is a professor in Chicano Latino ethnic studies, comparative ethnic studies, works in decoloniality, Islamophobia, world system, as well as a number of other issues that we will definitely delve into it. So it's really great to have you with us, Ramon, today.
Salam alaikum, Hatem. Thank you for the invitation.
Maybe just give us a little bit of background, and I don't know if everybody knows your background from Puerto Rico, which is also a long history of colonial struggle and an attempt to really come out of this continued lack of self-determinations for Puerto Rico. So just give us a little bit of short biography, if possible.
Well, in terms of activism, I've been since I was like 14 years old, involved in the struggles for anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles in Puerto Rico. As you all know, Puerto Rico is still a US colony. And, you know, we share in that sense, Hatem, you and I, that we come from countries that are still, in a sense, in a classical colonial situation. That is in classical colonialism in a way. So in that sense, I've been, you know, all my life involved in this. Also, I'm very involved also in the struggles in Latin America, Africa, Europe, and other places through the network of Decolonial International Network. And so I've been very involved in all of this also with the situation that is going on also in the region, in Venezuela, for example, all this crazy economic warfare and military warfare that the US is developing there with, you know, dramatic, awful consequences for Venezuela and the region at large. Also, as you know, in the last several years, there's been several coups d'etat organized by Washington, destroying democratic elected governments in Latin America. I've been very involved in that. The latest one is the coup d'etat against the indigenous president of Bolivia, Evo Morales. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and what comes after this coup d'etat, we all know, is always, you know, neoliberal policies, authoritarian regimes, and so on, you know. So this is an ongoing struggle in Latin America. I've been very involved in this all my life. So that's where I'm coming from. And also in the struggles for against racism, Islamophobia inside empires in Europe and the USA. So I also been very involved in those struggles too. Yeah. So this is where I'm coming from, you know, and I'm in a department that was created through strikes. Yeah. You know, so anyway, I try to follow the spirit of the ethnic studies strikes, you know, in my intellectual work.
Great. So maybe right now we could begin looking at your contribution of 1492 and the work that really of thinking about the trajectory of 1492 as a critical juncture in world history.
Yes.
How do we approach it, and why was it so important to actually think and center 1492 in your work?
Yeah, because 1492, I will say, is a very important date because it's, in a way, a year that in which you have the fall of Granada, that is the end of that part of Islamic civilization in the south of the Iberian Peninsula that was known as Al-Andalus. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's very important this history of the conquest of Al-Andalus, because the conquest of Al-Andalus was, in a way, it was all the methods of conquest that the Europeans deployed in many parts of the world were, in a sense, rehearsed there in the conquest of Al-Andalus. The first moment of the European colonial expansion began with the conquest of Al-Andalus. And I'm looking at it from, you know, I try not to go into the nostalgic mood that, oh, it was lost. That was a great moment in history, the coexistence of all these different, you know, spiritual and religious groups living together in peace, etc., which is great to vindicate that. But it also has a very important notion for us, which is that the methods they used in the conquest of Al-Andalus were extrapolated in the conquest of the Americas, Africa, in other parts of the world until today. And so that's why I see the study of the conquest of Al-Andalus by the Castilian Christian monarchy as a very important process to study, because a lot of the methods of conquest were rehearsed and developed there. Now, from the point of view of by January 2nd, 1492, they finally destroy Al-Andalus, the last remaining stronghold, which was Granada. And then 10 months later, they moved to the Americas. And I always say there was a coordination that was not accidental. There was a plan there before this happened, where they went first after Al-Andalus, after Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. And then once they conquer Al-Andalus, once they united the Iberian Peninsula under one religion, one state, one monarchy, then they move on to the Americas. That was the discussion they have a few years before between Christopher Columbus and the King and the Queen of Spain, that, Christopher Columbus was pushing to move, into the Atlantic, and that at that time they thought they were in India, by the way. So they thought they were going to Asia, but the point is that in that negotiation, the king and the queen told him, you need to wait until we finish with the conquest of Al-Andalus, finish with Granada, and then we can move on to the Americas. So I see this connected. That is, European historiography always disconnect us in crazy way. It always make us believe that our worst enemies are the brothers and sisters of the global South. And, if you look at the Eurocentric narrative, I'm coming from the Caribbean, they tell us that, that the worst, the people who sold us to slavery were the sub-Saharan Africans. Then they tell the sub-Saharan Africans that the people who colonize and conquer them are the Berbers from the north. Then they tell the Berbers that it's the Muslims who conquered them. Then they tell, the Arab Muslims who conquered them. Then they tell, you go on in this route, they tell, the Persians that it's the Muslim or it's this or that. And then they tell, the Chinese that, or India that is, they always find someone of the global South in this weird historiography to be blamed by anything that happened to these people. And my question is always, where are the Europeans in that history? They're never mentioned.
Well, because, even when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, so it does not have an identity. It's actually attributing the slave trade to the Atlantic Ocean rather than to the European powers. So we think that the ocean itself went to Africa, divided, sold weapons, and brought slaves to the coast, then to be transported to the New World. But we had a conversation a few times in Granada that part of Muslim historians is that they almost completely leave 1492 and the developments in the New World. And we've been trying to actually think both of Muslim history as part of world history without this disconnect that takes place.
Yes, this is very important, because part of what happened when you don't look at 1492 and the European expansion to the Atlantic, there are several problems that comes up. One of them, especially from the point of view of Muslims and from the point of view of Islamic civilization, one of them is that if you look at the history from the point of view of the North Africa, that is from the Mediterranean, or from Turkey or the Ottomans, to be more precise, what you see is the Europeans suddenly rising up from being a marginal village in the world, impoverished, obscurantists, to suddenly becoming, rich, wealthy, with all this wealth there, and the problem is that if you don't see the link between the rise of the West with the slavery and colonialism in the Atlantic, then the problem is that people start fetishizing modernity. That is, they buy the narratives of European modernity that are always self-serving. They will say, oh, we did it because we have all this knowledge, all this intelligence, we work hard, we developed this technology, that technology. This is all a very Eurocentric and problematic history. First, because all this wealth was thanks to having super exploited indigenous people and African people in the Americas. Second, because a lot of the technology they developed is what I call epistemic extractivism. In the early period of modernity, they took a lot of knowledge from different civilizations, especially Islamic civilization, that were much more advanced in terms of technology and science than what Europe was at the time. And then they will appropriate this. If you look at history of science as a discipline in Westernized universities, is full of white supremacist narratives, because they're always going to place there a white man as the origin of a lot of scientific discoveries and theories that were already there in Islamic civilization and other civilizations, that they just extracted them from there and recycled them as if it was created and originated and or discovered by themselves. And when you look, I mean, let's take as an example, we could take several examples, you know. If you look at, you know, Copernicus, for example, we celebrate 500 years of Copernicus. Well, guess what? Copernicus took a lot of his knowledge basically from the astronomers of Damascus in Islamic civilization that 300, 400 years before Copernicus have already demonstrated mathematically and in graphics that the Earth is not the center of the universe, that the Earth is going around the sun. And this was a knowledge in Islamic civilization 300-400 years before, but when you read history of science, they put Copernicus there as the center. In fact, a lot of that knowledge came to Europe through Al-Andalus. It was in Al-Andalus that this knowledge arrived to Europe, and then it was translated to Latin, to other languages at the time, and that's how many of Europeans got access to scientific and technological knowledges that at the time they were quite marginalized. Remember, it was Christendom at the time. They have a very problematic relationship between spirituality and science, and you know, in a sense, this religion, Christendom, was impeding them from developing science, while in other civilizations they were flourishing in science because they didn't have this dualistic notion between spirituality and knowledge and science, you know. But in Europe this happened, and that's why they took a lot of their knowledge from other civilizations, especially Islam, because Islam was at the borders of Europe, and therefore that was where they have some kind of contact with the rest of the world. But it is the conquest of the Americas through the Atlantic that if you don't look at it carefully, you're going to get embellished or you're going to fetishize modernity. Because in fact, and this is the narrative the Europeans love to play, that they did it because they did it by their own bootstrap, because they work hard, because they have all these geniuses, all this knowledge. Well, no, if you look at the history, they did not only economic extractivism, plundering the wealth of the Americas, but also they did epistemic extractivism, plundering other civilizations of their knowledge, and then recycling them as if they were their own, you know, they were the ones who invented everything. And that's what I'm saying. In history of science, we need to decolonize history of science because it's full of white supremacist garbage.
And that's maybe your idea of epistemicide, which is really a major contribution that you have. And I don't think that many who follow your work understand what you mean with epistemicide. We know the genocide. So maybe you could actually unpack for our audience, what do you mean by epistemicide that is being committed against the global South as well as the Western Hemisphere and the Muslim world as well?
Well, the term epistemicide has been used by other people before me.
Yeah.
the term itself, one of them, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, for example. My contribution to that discussion is to give a world historical perspective to this question. My position is that if you look at the westernized university today, and when I say westernized, I'm not saying Western, I'm saying westernized. It means it's everywhere in the world today. The epistemic privilege, that is the canon of thought of the disciplines, is always European men or Western men of 5 countries. You will read a French, a German, a British, an American, and secondarily an Italian. And you will have basically this, knowledge founded, the names change across discipline, but you're going to see Western men of these 5 countries being the canon of thought. In all the disciplines, the humanities, in the social science, natural science, wherever you go, it's always, you're going to read one of these nationalities. So, and it's always a man. We'll never read woman as part of the canon of thought. And my question is, I always say this has a name. I call this epistemic racism, sexism, because if you have excluded the rest of humanity from the canon of thought of the disciplines in the westernized university, then you're talking about epistemic racism. And if you have excluded all women, including the women of these 5 countries, then we're talking about sexism. That's why I think we have to name the foundation of knowledge of Western University in a clear way, and that's why I call it epistemic racist / sexism, and so this is the foundation of knowledge of the university we're at. Now, the question is that where is this coming from? And this is where I then make kind of my contribution is to try to answer this question. Why this happened? How is it that in the 21st century, we're reading, such a provincial disguised as universal canon of thought of white man of 5 countries? You see, where is this coming from? And this is where I trace back the moment when this happened, when Western men took power at the level of epistemology at a world scale, in the 4 genocides, epistemicides of what I will call the long 16th century. This period that goes from 1450 and 1650, these 200 years, is the moment of the formation of the modern world of modernity, world capitalism, and because it's the moment of the European colonial expansion. And the European colonial expansion, let's not forget, is not just an economic expansion. It's a civilizational expansion. They're destroying other civilizations and imposing their own civilization at a world scale. So what happened is that there is a genocide and epistemicide against Muslim and Jews in the conquest of Al-Andalus. There was a genocide epistemicide, that is genocide, killing of people. Epistemicide is the destruction of knowledge structures. In Al-Andalus, they were burning the libraries. And let's remember, just to give you an idea of the contrast between Christendom civilization in the north of Europe and Al-Andalus as part of Islamic civilization in the south of Europe, the largest, the Library of Cordoba under Al-Andalus have more than 500,000 books. The Library of Granada have more than 250,000 books. The largest library in Christendom Europe at the time did not have 1,000 books. This tells you something about the relationship to knowledge of these 2 civilizations that at the time were coexisting next to each other. Now, what I'm coming back to your question is the genocide epistemicide, destruction of people and knowledge in the conquest of Al-Andalus against Jews and Muslims, the genocide epistemicide in the conquest of the Americas against indigenous people, genocide epistemicide in the conquest of Africans and their mass kidnapping of Africans to be transported by force to the Americas, to be enslaved in the Americas. And another one, the 4th one, is the genocide epistemicide against women in Europe accused of being witches. They would be burned alive, accused of being witches. So these four genocide epistemicide are constitutive of Christendom, patriarchy, and racism that are at the foundation of the modern world. And so by the mid-17th century, when Descartes, who is considered the founder of Western philosophy, he said, I think, therefore I exist. In the common sense of the time, it was very clear who was this I, because it couldn't be a Muslim or a Jew after the conquest of Al-Andalus. It couldn't be an African after the conquest of Africa, mass kidnapping of Africans to be enslaved in America. It couldn't be an indigenous person after the conquest of the America. And it couldn't be a woman, not even a European woman, after the burning alive of women accused of being witches. So who is left? Who is this I? It was very clear that this I, the new foundation of knowledge, which, by the way, Descartes claims that have a God-I view. That is, he was, in a sense, it's in an idolatric kind of philosophy, because he claims that this I has the same attributes of the Christendom God. So now, who is this I? It's the white man, okay, who is now at the center of the world after conquering the world and exterminating many people. And that's what creates the conditions of possibility for the epistemic privilege of the white man over the rest of the world. And this is where you have the structures of epistemic racism, sexism. Now, 100 years later, you have Immanuel Kant, who is going to say in his anthropological writings that the white man above the Pyrenees Mountains, which are the mountains that divide the Iberian Peninsula from the north of Europe, have access to rationality, while the yellow man, black man, red man is in the Americas, indigenous men in the Americas, and people, who happen to be in the Iberian Peninsula, who began this whole process, that are influenced by Islamic, Jewish ideas and so on. They are irrational beings. And of course, he never mentioned women, because for him, women are irrational beings a priori. So there's nothing to argue. But look at how he already, 100 years later, is going to put the rationality in the Western man of North Europe, and he will immediately push out of rationality the rest of humanity. And you have to remember that the first secular scientific university that was formed in Berlin was founded under the epistemology of Kantianism. And so from the beginning, the type of university, secular scientific university we have today, which is the Humboldt University in Berlin, was the first one who had this structure. And we are, in a sense, we have inherited in universities at world scale this structure of university, of Western University of the Humboldt in Berlin, has as the foundation this racist ideology coming from, in this case, Kant, who was, in a sense, a disciple of Descartes, and continuing the tradition of the West of always putting their white men as the privilege in knowledge production over the rest of humanity. And this is where my contribution is. The epistemicides, the destruction of knowledge through conquest, was the mechanism they used to inferiorize other people around the world in terms of knowledge production, not only in terms of their social being, economic, political inferiorization along racist kind of political organization and economic organization. It was also epistemic racism that was there at the center through processes of epistemicide, destruction of the knowledge, inferiorization of the knowledge structures of wherever they conquer. And the other part, the part of genocide, is the part that is related to, in Al-Andalus, they used what is called the encomienda at the time, but today we call it settler colonialism, and which is highly correlated with genocide, which is a form of colonialism where the colonizers come with their families, take over properties, land, everything, and kick out the natives of the land, you know? And this, we have seen that for 500 years. And it began in the conquest of Al-Andalus, where the Christians from the north came and took over land, properties, houses, etc., privatized everything, you know, put it in their hands, then practice genocide because every Muslim or Jew who resists will be killed. And they were forced to conversion. If you did not convert, they will kill you. And so this is, in a sense, we call it today settler colonialism, and we see it from the conquest of Al-Andalus all the way to the conquest today of Palestine by the Israelis, you know? So this is, in a sense, an old method of conquest that they put forward in the early period of modernity in Al-Andalus. That's why I'm saying we need to study well that moment, because a lot of the methods we're seeing till today were, in a sense, rehearsed there. That's where they began these things.
Now, these days, again, some of the people that possibly are on the opposite side, they try to exceptionalize the Western history on the one hand, at the same time say that what happened or what took place is no different than what other people have done. In essence, to flatten the surface and to basically say there is no uniqueness to this modernity, this genocides, this epistemicides that we are experiencing. So how do we respond to this notion?
Yeah, this is a great question. And one of the things that I always say is that the West loves to universalize the forms of domination of today and make them transhistorical. That is, they try to trace back to Adam and Eve the beginnings of all the forms of domination, patriarchal, racist, capitalist, you name it. Everything was there from Adam and Eve. And that's a way of basically flattening out history and flattening out the world. And what they achieve with that is to create in us a common sense that turns into a very conservative ideology. I'll explain. If you think that all these forms of domination we see today have no history, they've been there because it's related. They're universal because they are, in a sense, human nature, right? Because it's there since Adam and Eve. And then there's nothing we can do about it. Let's just turn off the light and just make sure we are above and everybody below us. It's the law of the jungle. I mean, there's no way to deal with it. They try to dehistoricize these things in such a way that make us believe that racism, that, you know, Christendom, patriarchy, you name it, all these forms of domination we have today that were globalized through the European colonial expansion, that they were there since the human beings came to Earth, okay? Well, it's a fallacy, because in a sense, it makes us believe that there's nothing you can do about it, but after all, it's all human nature. It's false. If you look historically in a rigorous way, you could trace the moments of beginning of a lot of these forms of domination, of capitalism, of Christendom, patriarchy, of racism, and so on. For example, before your modernity, before 1492, you cannot claim that there was racism in the world at large. There were conflicts, there were problems, there were wars, there were terrible wars in many moments of history. I don't want to be romantic about the past and claim that the past was just a paradise. There were a lot of problems, but the forms of domination, we need to historicize them because they're not the same. The Roman Empire has certain logics of domination different from modern US imperialism, for example, or the Chinese lineage at the time was a different civilization, different forms of political authority. We have the tendency to call empire to everything that moves. This is very Eurocentric. And I always say, I accept the use of empire to name everybody as the day that they will accept that we use sultanate to talk about Spanish Sultanate, British Sultanate, American Sultanate. You see what I'm trying to say? What I'm trying to say is how they're using a particular form of political authority and then projecting it to the rest of the world. And then they start talking about Chinese Empire, Ottoman Empire, Aztec Empire, Inca Empire. I'm sorry, this is a very Eurocentric concept because you're talking locally, taking your local European history and making it world history. So you're trying to project the forms of political authority of the Roman Empire, for example, and to the rest of the world when we are talking about forms of political authority that were very different. And the same thing as if someone from the Muslim world start using sultanate and say, okay, the Spanish Sultanate, the British Sultanate. I mean, no, you're taking a particular form of political authority to and extrapolate and universalize it as if everybody was the same. That's not the case. So we need to, in a sense, historicize these things, understand that the Ottomans were not an empire. The Ottomans were, in a sense, a sultanate. The Chinese were a lineage. The Aztecs were something completely different, etc., etc. And we need to historicize these things. And also the question about racism, the question about considering a whole group of human beings as being non-human, as being animals, is something very, very new in world history.
Your article on what is racism, which I put on the chat, I think is very, very important as a way to get us into the discussion on race and racism.
Yes, because there's a difference between prejudice. There's always been prejudice in history. Prejudice of one group against the other, etc. But that's not racism. Racism is always structural. It's always systematic racism. That's what we're talking about when we talk about racism. It's not racial prejudice. It's not stereotype prejudice. That's not enough to define racism. That there were prejudice in history, oh my God, it's been in many, you can demonstrate prejudice across history, but that's not racism. And this is where the confusion comes, because you don't have a systematic organization of the state based on marking human beings as below the line of the humans. That's very problematic. The same thing, you know, it doesn't exist before 1492. In my work, in my paper or publication on the 4 genocide epistemicides of the long 20th century, I explained there the moment when you start having this inferiorization of human beings and coming into a structural racism, you know, from 1492 on. And one of the major moments is the debate between Las Casas and Sepúlveda in the Spanish state that I discussed there. And, you know, how these people were debating about the people they colonized in America, indigenous people there. And they were, you know, in a sense, debating if they were humans or not, and what to do with them. And of course, they were debating if they have, at that time, the debate was not on issues of color, was if they have a soul or not. If you don't have a soul, you were like an animal. If you have a soul, then you were a human being. So there was all these debates going on in theological terms, but that later turned from people without a soul, that turned in the 19th century into scientific racism, into people without the human constitution, or later without the human DNA. So what you have in modern racism is the secularization of the 16th century theological Christendom racism into 19th century scientific racism, when the authority of knowledge was displaced away from Christian theology and went into pseudoscience. And then they start shifting the marker from people without soul to people without the human DNA. Now, the same thing with Las Casas discourse, in that was the Sepúlveda. Las Casas will say, we need to, in a sense, Christianize these people. They are barbarians, they are primitive. So we need, these are barbarians to be Christianized. Now, that turned in the 19th century with anthropology and other pseudosciences into primitive to be civilized, from barbarians to be Christianized to primitive to be civilized. And then you have the civilizational racist discourse there. So the debate between Las Casas and Sepúlveda is very interesting, because Sepúlveda will coin what we call today biological racist discourses, while Las Casas will coin the culturalist racist discourse. And they were policy of state. They were not just a prejudice or, no, it's that if you were born in this group, you will be immediately assigned to certain positions in the division of labor, in the society, etc. So this was structural, and it's still structural today. It hasn't changed in that sense. There's been changes over time in how racist discourses work, etc. The markers, all of this become very complex today. But in a sense, what you have in common about racism is systematic racism. In the past, for example, one of the ways in which Europeans love, Eurocentric thinking, love to claim that what you see in the modern world today, after all, is coming from the past, is the word, for example, slavery, for example. Well, I'm sorry, but modern slavery is not the same as pre-modern slavery. Modern slavery is capitalist and is racist. Pre-modern slavery, if you look at slavery in Islamic civilization, for example, it was about people capturing wars and so on, and soldiers that were capturing a war, they became slaves, but then slaves have rights. So there were many sultans that were born slaves in Islamic history. And the same thing happened with, if you look at the Roman Empire, or if you look at, the Chinese, in other parts of the world where you have form of slavery. In Greek civilization, for example, you have form of slavery, but they were never, in a sense, were a marker about if you were inferior in relation to humanity. It was a complete different structuring of the way slavery works in different civilizations. But it's very easy, given our Eurocentric common sense of today, to turn all these concepts, colonialism, empire, slavery, etc., into world transhistorical concepts, as if they were there since Adam and Eve. And this is very problematic. And this is where I'm calling for attention to the fact that 1492 is a cutting moment, a before and after, for example, in relation to capitalism, in relation to modernity, and in relation to racism. And of course, Christian non-patriarchy, because when they expanded to many parts of the world, they imposed a form of patriarchy that was Christian non-patriarchy. And there were many parts of the world they colonized where there was no patriarchy. The relations between men and women was not exactly patriarchy. And the same thing happened with the question of race. There were many, in the rest of the world, there was not such a thing. And so they, in the European colonial expansion, they brought to many parts of the world all these problems that were not there before. So I'm calling attention to this because, and if you look at the book of Oyeronke Oyewumi, for example, The Invention of Woman, she goes in detail about how in West Africa, there was no patriarchy. It was the European who brought patriarchy there. Or you look at the work of Silvia Marcos in Mesoamerica, where she shows also that in the indigenous civilization in Mesoamerica, there was no patriarchy. It was something brought by the Europeans and so on. I mean, so these are things that we need to be rigorous in the way we discuss these things, because otherwise we reduce them to human nature. And the moment we reduce them to human nature, then there's nothing you can do about it. And that's false. There's many things we can do about it. All these forms of domination have a beginning and will have an end. But for that, we need to struggle against the naturalization of these forms of domination that have been constructed socially and politically over centuries.
And one point that both of us are engaged in is an attempt to really decolonize the university. Because all of these replication and continued naturalizations of phenomena, it's actually located at the modern university. And even as we speak today with attempt to challenge racism, anti-Black racism, and racism in general, we see also individuals and movements that are also pointing out to the monuments and the statues that continues to be a way to celebrate and glorify that part of history. So how do we deal with decolonizing the university, decolonizing knowledge, but also simultaneously making sure that the monuments, the statues that glorify the past, because as you possibly know, some within the liberal or neoliberal political arena, they were quick to say, oh, this is part of history, we need to preserve it. And again, if they wanted to preserve history, why don't we bring all the monuments that were stolen that sit in the Louvre or the London Museum and the British Museum or other places?
Yeah, right now you have in your background a photo of UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. I can see a few buildings on the back with names of people who happen to be white supremacists, racist guys at the time, and they
we both teach in the same building, Barrows Hall.
Exactly, and they still have these names there. I mean, just ridiculous. How are we celebrating, white supremacy till today? Just look at this, something that looks insignificant, but is very significant. The name of these buildings, and of course the statues and so on. I mean, this is very problematic, but in terms of decolonizing the university, for me, there is something about the content that, of course, is reflected in the name of the buildings and in the statues that you see in these westernized universities across the world. But the content of this is this epistemic racism, sexism I was talking about early on, where white man of five countries monopolize the canon of thought. How do we get out of that? We need two things. The first thing we need is to bring epistemic diversity into the classroom. We cannot have curriculum or syllabus of courses where it's all white man of five countries. That cannot continue to happen. We need to diversify our curriculum in terms of different epistemic perspectives, both worldwide, but also in terms of gender too. We cannot continue centering, there's no decolonization without depatriarchalization, and also there's no decolonization without decolonizing the canon of thought. I mean, if you keep teaching white men of five countries, this is a very, how can I say, particularistic kind of knowledge disguised as universal. It's very provincial, disguised as universal. And in fact, what we need to do is to bring epistemic diversity into the classroom, but also we need to decolonize the disciplines. For example, let's take something like sociology, for example, a department. Well, why is it that you're reading there, again, the men of the five countries? We're reading a French, a German, a British, we're reading an American, an Italian, etc. And why don't we bring all the knowledge of social science that is being produced in many parts of the world? And by the way, the knowledge of these men of the five countries is based on the social historical experience of only these five countries, which are very exceptional in relation to the development of the rest of the world, and the social historical condition of the rest of the world. I mean, the rest of the world, if you look at India, South Africa, China, Brazil, etc. If you look at, Syria or many countries around the world have a complete different social historical experience. And the categories of thought built upon the social historical experience of European countries and the USA are very limited, because it's only accounting for a very particular of the core country metropolitan centers of the world economy, who have a very particular, it's the 20%, let's put it this way, or 15% of the world. What about the critical thought developed by people in the global south?
Maybe we could get to people in a very specific way. You could actually study and get a BA in political science, an MA in political science, and possibly get into the PhD without actually studying or being introduced to any political scientists from China, from
Absolutely.
India, from any parts of Africa or the Muslim world, unless you're researching, let's say, China. So you study a couple of Chinese political scientists, and you get the introduction to political science or philosophy or sociology, and you are only reading and engaging the scholars from those 5 countries, and maybe every once in a while you'll get some article that mentions someone else, and then you'll have what you call I call it doctrine of discovery. You have a Southern Hemisphere scholar that a white scholar discovered them, and their meaning becomes through the Discovery Act. So that we still have doctrine of discovery taking place today in relations to Southern Hemisphere. So when we speak about decolonizing knowledge and bringing that epistemic diversity, is that you should not have an introduction to political science course without actually being a course that looks at the contribution of Chinese 4,000, 5,000 years continuous history, or India, or the Muslim world, or Africa, or parts of Latin America.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a fundamental problem of the Westernized university. And again, when I say Westernized university, I repeat for those who didn't listen to me at the beginning, this is a global structure of domination that exists everywhere in the world. It's not just in the global north that you have Westernized universities. The sad part of the story is to have people in the Southern Hemisphere absorbing this Eurocentric knowledge and then being colonized by this Eurocentric knowledge and then repeating it to try to deal with the problems of their countries. I mean, this is a disaster, but this is what exactly the system wants to happen. They want to have the Westernized elites in the global South ready to do the job, and that's why this Western university is a stronghold. It's a stronghold of the system, global system we're in. And the other part of decolonizing knowledge is this part of epistemic diversity is already a struggle and a battle because all the mechanisms they have to censor students and people who try to do something different. They have all these mechanisms to exclude you from the university if you don't follow the canon of thought that is supposed to be. I mean, so there's a big censorship here. A lot of students that try to do PhDs bringing epistemic diversity to their work, they're immediately penalized, they're immediately threatened that if they don't work with this or that author, then you're out and that kind of thing, So this is or the ignorance of many of these white scholars that say, oh, but who is this person you're citing? We never heard of this person. How could that be a philosopher? How could that be a sociologist? I mean, this is not sociology. This is what you're doing is not sociology, it's not anthropology. You see what I mean? Because you're not citing the white man of the 5 countries. I mean, this is all these mechanisms. But apart from that, there is another problem, which is the disciplines themselves. The disciplines were formed in 19th century Europe. European empires needed knowledge for the projects of domination. So they needed knowledge about the people they colonized. There you go, anthropology. They needed knowledge about the geopolitical strategies in the world. That's geography. They needed knowledge about the economic policy of the state, economics. They needed knowledge about the public policy of the state, political science. When you go at each discipline, you could see its origins in the needs of European empires in the 19th century. And we're in the 21st century, carrying over structures of knowledge that were formed in the interest of European empires. Why are we dividing knowledge in this crazy way? I mean, when in fact, what we need in that sense is to identify the problems of the world, okay? What are the problems of humanity that humanity faces? And then let's bring epistemic diversity to the study of those problems instead of dealing with disciplinary problems. If you go, what happened to many of us, we go to academic conferences after 2 days, we get out depressed from the conference because it's all about disciplinary issues that have no relevance to what is happening in the world outside. So, and big egos fighting each other, and disciplinary issues of the discipline that are unrelated to the real problems of the world. So, in a sense, we go in what some people have called disciplinary decadence. And that disciplinary, that's why we are, after an academic conference, we are 1 month recovering from the conference. We come out depressed, because in fact, what we need is not to keep splitting knowledge in such, talking about social science, for example, in such, fragmented way. What we need is to identify problems. For example, the ecological problem, the problem of the nation state, okay, the problem of financial crisis, the problem of racism, the problem, and then we can bring epistemic diversity to deal with these problems, instead of organizing ourselves into disciplines such as political science, anthropology, social, etc. We need to, in a sense, come up with a study about problems, and then bring all the knowledge we can to make sense of what we're trying to research, and in a sense, bring that epistemic diversity we've been calling for to study the problems that humanity is dealing with today. That way, we'll be in a complete different university that I will call pluriversity instead of university, because it will have pluriversalism, ingrained, inherent to the structure of knowledge production, by bringing in all the different epistemology and critical thought that humanity has produced into whatever we're studying. But what we do is that it's completely different. We're reading white man of 5 countries, and then we have to apply, look at this world, the white man of 5 countries to whatever we're studying, and then what we do there is, there's a lot of, in a sense, symbolic violence in the knowledge production there, because you are, in a sense, taking concepts and categories that were built upon the social historical experience of Italy, Germany, France, UK, or USA, and extrapolating to realities that have nothing to do with that. And not only that, there are people already in those regions of the world that have already thought about the categories to understand their own world, and then we don't study them. We don't know who they are. We don't know their concepts. And then what we do is importing categories, Eurocentric categories, producing other contexts to realities that are completely different. This is not science. This is a complete, a complete kind of enterprise of producing ignorance.
Again, if you think about the whole infrastructure of development theory and the international organizations that come from the global north to the global south, which becomes another form of interventionist approach in the development theory. They're not really there to solve the issues. They basically are trying to introduce a Eurocentric modalities to societies that are completely and totally different, Muslim or otherwise.
Absolutely, because what they want is that the policies that the westernized elites, people who are trained into this Western paradigm, who become Eurocentric, being African, being Latin American, being Arab, being Asian, being whatever, they want them then in positions of power in these neo-colonial structures so that they do the job for the West. Because in a sense, if your common sense and your theories and knowledge is framed under the ideology of white man of 5 countries, you're going to be a useful tool for the domination exploitation of your country. And that's why this is kind of the development theory is a classical example of that, because then it goes into the center about policies of development that countries are going to pursue. And that's why
which pushes neoliberal economic modalities,
Absolutely.
privatization, increasing your export to the global market. So in essence, it's almost continue to fuse you to your ex-colonial motherland.
Absolutely. It's a continuation of colonial times, but now under neoliberal policies and so on, produce where? Produce in University of Chicago, Oxford, La Sorbonne, the global north. And then people in the global south are supposed to take that as the truthful knowledge. And there is an aspect of this epistemic racism, sexism, and that is that white men of the 5 countries, they not only know what is truth and what is reality, but they know what is best for you, because they think of themselves as being superior knowledge. So they are universal beings. The rest of the people produce only particularistic knowledge, and they don't know better. So here is the knowledge come from the global north that is supposed to be telling people what is reality, what is truth, and what is good for you. And if you resist, then you're in trouble, because then if you don't follow the policies that they're telling you under their knowledge structures, then then you go to another step, which is sanctions or military intervention or CIA organized coup d'etat or whatever they can do to make sure that they put in power people who work for them and whose paradigm is, in a sense, a continuation of the Eurocentric worldview.
Right. I want to shift a little bit right now to speak about Islamophobia, which is one of the subjects that we wanted to delve into. You wrote a few pieces on Islamophobia. Your piece in the Islamophobia Studies Journal was very important in terms of how the various ways to approach Islamophobia. And I thought your article was very, very critical, and I'm going to share it on the chat. So what's your approach to dealing with Islamophobia?
Well, for me, Islamophobia is a form of racism. I think there is a confusion because, in a sense, the way you could see that in the article you're going to share about what is racism, that racism, we tend to take the markers of race of the society we are born and raised and universalize them and forget that in colonial history, the colonizers have used many markers. I'll give you an example. We tend to take color racism as the definition of racism. We forget that in colonial history, they have used other markers, like a marker of identity, like religious identity or national identity, or they use different markers to construct the superiority, inferiority along the line of the human, and to organize the society along a systemic racism, and state racism. Now, Islamophobia, because it's not color racism, many people dismiss it as if it was just a kind of a Muslim, prejudice against Muslims or phobia against Muslims. No, it's more profound, because we're talking about the systematic domination, systematic application of violence and dispossession against large number of people who happen to be identified as Muslims. Doesn't matter what the color of your skin. So I'm saying that because there are, in a sense, markers that we tend to confuse or reduce racism to color racism, because it's probably one of the most important markers in the world. And it's in the case of the USA, we are born into those kind of markers, but it's not the only one.
But also thinking that the majority of the Muslim population is from the global south. So there is a dimension in relation to that. And people don't realize that, again, the work of Frantz Fanon in Algeria was dealing with the Muslim setting. But it seems that there's complete erasure of that part of the engagement with the Muslim subject in coloniality around the demarcation of human and subhuman.
Yes, and I said, listen, if you look where we began. We began in the conquest of Al-Andalus. We began in that moment of the European colonial expansion, began against the Muslim and Jews also, but especially Muslims were the groups ruling Al-Andalus. So, in a sense, Islamophobia has always been there from day one in the European colonial expansion. And when they refer to Muslim population, which, as you well said, the great majority are coming from, or are in a sense descendants of people from the global south, you have there obviously structures of domination along the line of the human, where they place superiority in the case of white Christian populations, and then they inferiorize everybody else. But one of the markers that they have developed is the religious marker. I'll give you an example. The case of Ireland. The case of Ireland is very interesting because it's a very interesting example of how is, in a sense, about why I'm saying Islamophobia is racist. The Irish, in terms of color of skin, are white, right? And probably whiter than the British. But the British developed a racist colonial policy against the Irish, but they couldn't use color racism as a marker, but it didn't work there. So what did they use? They used religious identity. The Catholics, who were the Irish, and the Protestants, who were the British. And when you look at the state policies, colonial policies of the British state, you have what is a constant of every racist, structural racist situation, which is violence and dispossession. They were dispossessing the population from their resources in a violent, systematic way. And this is what I think differentiates racism from other forms of prejudice or other forms of discrimination, is when you have in place a structure of domination of superiority, inferiority along the line of the human, where you are applying in an institutional structural way violence and dispossession in a systematic way against those you have dehumanized below the line of the human. And those who are above the line of the human are the hyper-humanized, considered superior, and below are the people dehumanized. But the consequences of this is poverty, is marginalization, is premature death, for many of these populations, and premature death can arrive to you in many ways, not only with a bullet from the police. It could arrive because you don't have good health care, you don't have good food, you cannot eat good food, you are devastated. So these are, I think, a very important concept we need to keep in mind when we talk about racism, which is the question about violence and dispossession being systematically implemented by institutions and the state against a population. And when you look at that, look at the so-called war on terror at a war scale. We went from anti-communism to now Islamophobia, anti-Muslim. Now the new marker in the International Division of Labor of who is the enemy and all of that went from the communist to the Muslim. And of course, here is prison industrial complex and all these industries that live off war, and they need enemies. So when the Soviet Union disappeared, they needed to invent a new enemy, because there is a lot of money involved, and they have a budget from the US state, channeled to for all these wars, and selling weapons. So you have now a new enemy, and that new enemy, look at how many Muslims have been killed over the past 20 years. Just look at the number. We're talking about millions and millions. So this is racism. This is systematic racism. I mean, this is white supremacy, but the marker there is the Muslim, so as the savage, the terrorist, the barbarian, etc. And then you have, of course, among Muslim population, victims of these warfares in the last 20 years, you have people of different colors. You could have brown skin, black skin, etc. I'm not denying that in the modern world, of course, a black Muslim will be in a worse position, but we cannot fall into the trap of thinking that someone who is not black Muslim do not suffer racism. I'm sorry. And the same thing happened with Latinos in the USA. Latinos also suffer racism, and you have many colors along the Latino category. It's a multiracial group, but they lump them all together into the category of Latino, the same way they do with Muslims. And now you have, in a sense, racism that is marked through identity, ethnic identity, or through religious identity, and this we need to pay attention to, because part of the white supremacy game is divide and rule. So one of the things they do is to then, you know, to have situations where people think that, you know, and this happened, you know, you have Black people that do not understand well what's the forms of colonialism and racism experienced by Latinos or by Muslims. Then you have Muslims that do not understand well the history of being racialized along color racism and through slavery and that history. And you have other people who do not understand indigenous history, you know, and so on and so. This creates a situation of divide and rule, because then suddenly we go into the Olympics of oppression. Oh, I am more oppressed than you. Oh, no, you are more oppressed than me. Or, you know, and then we go into a crazy kind of, we don't see each other as victims of the same system of white supremacy, but we see each other as competing on each other about who is the most oppressed. That's crazy. That doesn't build anything. This is suicidal for us not to be united and try to be sensitive and understanding that the forms of colonization built by white supremacy have been different, and the markers have been different across different groups. And part of the idea of why they do this is also because it's a way of divide and rule. If you manage to keep them fighting each other, split in the markers of racism, you know, and people not seeing each other in solidarity, then it's a perfect deal for the powers that be, because then the people, victims of white supremacy, are never able to construct and fight together in a political struggle against their domination.
Maybe as we get into the last part of the discussion, is that many Muslims who attempt to deal with Islamophobia begin to locate it in attempting to have assimilation, integration, to make ourselves look good. So there's a whole part of that discourse which really does not understand the structure of racism and this integration, assimilation, being or acting as a good Muslim in order for you to be accepted by a cluster of white supremacy that actually negates you at the line of the human.
Absolutely. This is a very, very confusing issue. Many Muslims that think that the way out is by integration into the structures, get recognition, become the good Muslim, when in fact the whole policy of war against terror and the whole Islamophobia industry is precisely built upon a whole systematic structure that is economic, political, cultural, you name it, media, of defining a new enemy in the face of the end of the Cold War. And there is a lot of money involved in this, you know, and therefore to believe that if you try to show that, oh no, Muslims, we're good, oh no, that you're going to change something, you are being naive. Because in fact, the white supremacists, they don't respect anything from you, you see, and especially if you don't fight back and you don't resist. So what is going to happen is that you're going to be, in a sense, incorporated in a subordinate way, maybe privileging a few elites there by giving them peanuts, while the rest of the community is living under surveillance and systematic exclusion. So this is where I think that there are some Muslim leaders that fall into the traps of believing that by being a good Muslim, that they will change their behavior against Muslims. No, this is not a problem of confusion in the minds of the white supremacist imperialist structures of domination. This is an issue of a structural and systematic domination that they put in place to make more money, to dominate regions of the world, to get access to raw material from different regions of the world. And this is broader than just, you know, you can try to get recognition, you can try to get some, oh, I'm good, I'm not like this other, whatever, and you're going to be in the same, you know, in the same position of subordination. In fact, they're not going to respect you, never respect you. They're going to just play with you and use you, you know, against the community. And this is where I think that we need to be very careful with this good good Muslim, bad Muslim strategy, because I think it's very naive. We need to, in a sense, understand that when we talk about racism, we're not talking about people that do not have education. When we talk about racism, we're talking about systemic structures of domination. You're not going to change that by giving their better education about we Muslim, we are this, we are good, we're not bad, you are ignorant about this or that. No, 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 no. This is not going to change anything in that way, because in fact, what you need is a transformation of the structures of domination. That requires a political movement. That's not going to change by you trying to educate or convince the colonizers. They're not going to change. They have interests to defend, and they're not going to give up on their interests unless there is a political struggle, you know, fighting them and beating them. There's no way out of that. And this history is full of examples of this. I mean, and so that would be my answer.
Now, maybe the last comment for maybe both of us is, can you share your insights on the latest developments in the Arab world in which two blocs are emerging, United Arab Emirates aligning with Israel and going against the rest of the Muslim world? I wouldn't say the rest of the Muslim world, because United Arab Emirates is recognized Israel or having a peace deal. Egypt has a peace deal with Israel, Jordan, Mauritania, Bangladesh. There is background relations with Morocco. So there is all of this effort that is taking place in the Muslim world. So how do you locate it within decolonial thought and think of these moves that are taking place in what I consider neoliberal post-colonial states? That's what we have, that are striking a deal with a regional hegemonic power.
You remember when I said early in the conversation, the westernized elites that are now managing the neo-colonial states, you see? Well, that could come with a black face, a brown face, a Muslim face, a Chinese face, whatever. You know, you have, in a sense, neo-colonial elites produced by the West in terms of the way they think about the world. So you have forms of westernized elites that could, you know, that are coming from third world countries with different cultures, different religions or spiritual practices. But what matters is what is the epistemology under which they are functioning. And so you could have, there are many states around the world today, and that's one of the success of this capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world system. One of the success is to precisely have been successful in terms of mental colonization. So you have now elites working for the West in positions of power in the global South, in the formally independent countries. So this is an example of sold out. You had them last week in a video you went on in a very, you know, a very systematic way about the history that this is not new. I mean, elites in the Arab world selling out to the Zionists and to the imperialist forces, it's not new. It's been there for a long time. And you just mentioned now examples of how this has been going on. I mean, you could see many elites and states around the Muslim or Arab world that, you know, where you have this kind of people. I mean, these elites are there not by accident. These elites are there systematically supported by the West to keep doing the job for the West. What is that job?
I could make the immediate connection. If you remember in my lecture in Grenada, in that Muslim elites began to be trained and educated at the beginning of the 1800s in Eurocentricity. And what we have today is most of your elites and the ruling elites, the intellectual, the scholar, are all Eurocentric in their worldview. Their economics is Eurocentric, their understanding of history Eurocentric, even their understanding of Islam and Islamic law and Islamic discourses is Eurocentric. So the relationship to what we are witnessing today with the United Arab Emirates and Israel is a byproduct of this 200 years of a shifting of the epistemological structure of a society that now is actually reproducing its Eurocentricity in the service of the ex-colonial masters. Remember that this is the product of the British. This is the framework of the British, the French, and inherited by the United States as the colonial powers that have framed this region in the way that we are experiencing.
Yeah, Hatem has been mentioning Granada several times. This is a summer school we have every year in Granada in the month of June. And I invite everybody who's listening to join us there, because we're trying to think about these questions about Islam and coloniality and decoloniality, you know. So this, the course you give there is, for me, has been an eye-opening course in Granada, because you show very well how from the 19th century, the West have been able to, in a sense, colonize many key players in the Islamic civilization at the time that, in a sense, start imitating the West. This is related to the early question you raised, which is 1492. If you look at Europe from, let's say, the Ottomans, and you look at it across the Mediterranean, but you don't see the Atlantic, then you become, in a sense, embellished with the rise of the West. And you say, oh, they're doing something that we haven't done. Oh, we need to imitate them. No, what they've done is to plunder the Americas, is to plunder other places to be where they are today. What they did was to plunder the knowledge, even from Islamic civilization itself, to be where they are today. Now, if you don't see that connection, then it's very easy to look from the Ottoman, you know, from the east side of the Mediterranean into Europe, and suddenly start looking at, oh my God, these people are becoming very rich, very wealthy, and scientific development, all this stuff. What are they doing that we are not doing? And then you start thinking that there's something wrong with you. And then you start internalizing inferiority. Then you start thinking, oh, there might be something wrong with me. Oh, there might be something with Islam. Oh, we need to reform Islam. And then you start importing concept of the Christians, such as reforming Christianity, you know? And you say, oh, they did a reformation, we should do the same. And then suddenly you become an Islamic reformist. And then you start importing ideas from the West into Islam in a way that you have explained masterfully in these courses in Granada. And that's why I always insist you should write a book about this, because it's very important what you're doing with that. Yeah, because it's something that I think that very few people know. And if you don't know that history well, how the West, in a sense, colonized and transformed Islamic theology in a very problematic way, then it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that the Islam we are seeing today is the authentic Islam. But this happened not only in Islamic civilization, but it happened also among indigenous civilizations in many parts of the world. They start, in a sense, importing concepts from the West that today are recycled as authentic, as some kind of authentic indigeneity.
Yeah, and the challenge that we're, again, is how to really have a re-examination of almost 200 to 300 years of history without an infrastructure to actually undertake this effort. As you know, and we have discussed this, there is not a single center on decolonial thought in the Muslim world. There's so many centers of studying how to embrace modernity, of how to improve the car that is brought to you by Eurocentricity, or how to bring more of X, Y, and Z from the global north, but not a single center, a single academic intellectual program that examines what happened to you with your own eyes, with your own scholarship. And that's, again, is some of the challenges that we are facing.
For example, when you go to some of Muslim majority countries and you talk about Islamophobia or things like this, they think that the way out is to become more assimilated to the West, economically, politically, culturally. And they think that the Islamophobia is just a misunderstanding. What we need is to do publicity to educate the West about how good Muslims are, you know? And I'm sorry, it's nothing to do with the ignorance or misunderstanding. It's a structure of domination that you're not going to transform by trying to educate these white supremacist imperialist elites. You have to fight them. There's no other way out. They're not going to be convinced by anything. They know what they're doing.
I usually use the example that, the United States policy in El Salvador are Christians, they're Catholics, but that did not stop the policy of using power and domination for a particular policy. And it's a continuation of Monroe Doctrine, of US policy in Latin America, or the policy that they use in Haiti, which is, again, predominantly Christian, Catholic, and they have carried 2 coups against Father Aristide, remove him from his office. He's a Christian priest. Yes. So again, Muslims tend to actually almost completely not understand the politics, the discourses, the colonial discourses, the post-colonial discourse, and neoliberal economic modalities and all that. And they think if just we give them a Islam 101 tab of presentation, all of a sudden, the George Bushes, the Trumps, the Netanyahus, Macron, or Johnson, or Geert Wilders, and the rest of them, all of a sudden, maybe they're going to come because they want to tour Mecca, because all of a sudden, Islam 101 got them what they needed.
Yeah, this is amazing, because I think, in a sense, what happened is that many Muslims get caught in the question of identity and lose sight of the question of structures, that these structures are in place not only in Muslim majority countries, but also in Christian majority countries. So they're deploying different discourses depending on where they're colonized. So when they go to the Middle East or other places, then they say, oh, the war on terror, Islamic terrorism, blah, blah, blah. But then when they come to the America, then they talk about, the Venezuela, these people are dictators, these people are communists, these people are that. You see, depending on where they are, they will use different discourses.
The Orientalist discourse in Latin America, you use the drug cartel as a reason or as a focal point. In the Muslim world, you use the terrorists. In other places, you actually find something as a specific and you amplify it as a way to continue to put the structure of dominations and interventionist policies in there.
Yeah, for example, Maduro, the president of Venezuela, he was just accused, and there is a call to arrest him and all the leadership of the Venezuelan government under a cartel that Trump administration have invented, the Soles cartel. It's Sol in English is son. And so they invented a cartel that doesn't exist. To say these people are, mafia, drug cartels, etc. And they invented a name to call the government of Maduro in Venezuela democratically elected. Okay, they call them as some kind of cartel, and then they're calling to arrest them. There's the U.S. put forward an arrest call through Interpol to all the leadership of Venezuela. What is happening in Venezuela? It's similar to the Middle East. There is a lot of oil. They have the largest, oil resources in the world. And so now, because there's no Muslims there, they cannot say these are Islamic terrorists. What do they say? Well, these are drug cartels, and they're dominating Venezuela, and we need to topple this government. Why? Because this government took sovereign control over the oil, and have taken the resources of oil to improve the situation of Venezuelans out of poverty. And the U.S. doesn't like that. The U.S. wants the resources of oil in the hands of American transnational corporations. As simple as that. And it's the same thing in the Middle East. The only difference is that they will say we're here because of Islamic terrorists when they are after the oil fields. And here they're saying we're here because these people are drug cartels. You see, this is what we need to be discussing in a global way so we can see the big picture and not get caught in the different type of strategies that they develop in different regions and think that there's something exceptional about what they're doing in a region, because then you fall into the good Muslim, bad Muslim thing. Or into people in Latin America saying, oh, no, we're not mafia people, we're good people, you know, we are, you know, and then falling to this trap, trying to prove the empire that you're a good guy, you're not a mafia people. I'm sorry. They're not doing this because, you know, they want to, you know, to make you, that because they have a misunderstanding about you. They're doing this on purpose. They know what they're doing. They're after your resources, after your country. They just want to take over, you know? So if you don't see this, you get very confused.
Yeah. There's Mohad's, he wants some words or some comments about Portugal, Guantanamo, and he put some questions. So can you give him something on Portugal? What's your view on Portugal and in Guantanamo, just briefly?
Well, recently in Portugal, there's been, you know, a lot of racial conflicts, you know, and there's been a call by a right-wing group to expel from the country some of the people in parliament, elected in parliament, and some of the, you know, black activists against racism in Portugal. And this is an ongoing thing right now. These are like kind of white supremacists in Portugal mobilizing in this direction. Guantanamo, well, Guantanamo in a sense is a metaphor of what they're doing worldwide. You know, in a sense, this exceptionalism of, you know, having an area that becomes exceptional to rule of law, rule of rights, and so on. You know, it's something they have spread all over the world with these dictatorships all over. So in a sense, Guantanamo is a condensed example of the kind of policy they do at a world scale, because there are many countries. Look at Bolivia today after the coup. Now they're torturing people like in Guantanamo, they're killing people, they're doing all kind of atrocities that they do in Guantanamo. And in a sense, what happened now is that, in a sense, US citizens, because of Guantanamo, you remember, have been Guantanamoized. Because if you remember that law passed by Obama, where he extended the rule of not having habeas corpus, that was, you know, you are innocent until proven guilty, he dismissed that with that declaration he made in 2012, I think, December 2011, where he passed a new act where he takes all this, exceptionalism of Guantanamo in the eyes of the US Constitution, making now spread all over. And now anybody could, under an accusation of terrorism in the USA, can be locked down in a prison, throw the key away without passing through a judge or a court of law. And this power is now in the hands of the state. So that's, in a sense, Guantanamo is a metaphor of the world we're living today in many ways, including USA. You know, there are many, many Muslims in the USA that have been locked down like this, you know, like accused of false accusations, terrorism, whatever, false accusations, and immediately put in jail in situations of exceptionalism using this kind of laws that exist in Guantanamo. So I say that Guantanamo is part of the zone of non-being, of Fanon's zone of non-being. And in a sense, that zone exists at a world scale. 85% of the population of the world are in the zone of non-being, submitted to violence and dispossession on a daily basis. And that's how this system works. And so we need to understand that Guantanamo is not anymore an exception, it's the rule in the world at large.
Thank you, Ramon. This has been really a fruitful, exciting discussion. We covered many, many areas. We could stay talking for the next 2 or 3 hours, but I know you want to spend time with your family. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you not on campus, but online, since we're going to be back teaching next week. Wish you and all your family the best, and hopefully we'll get back on campus and teach in person, because we're doing a lot on Zoom these days.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Hatem, for the invitation.
You're welcome. And be with us next week. We have a couple of other talks next week. We'll look forward to having you, everyone. This will be posted both on Facebook and YouTube, and you could access it. And look forward to continue to engage with you to make transformative education outside of the walls of the university. So again, education is a transformative tool. And what we need is to make it possible for us to understand the world that we are living in order to change it to the better. So thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.